All right, so I noticed, and I'm just kind of making a note, that a lot of these things are kind of violent. Those objects, the sea, not so much violent, so I'm going to think about how that plays into the context as a whole. Heartache and shock are things that are overwhelming, so I might just make a note of that. So now I'm going to think about the figurative language. And I really just like that one, the Sea of Troubles. I think that one's really interesting. So I think I'm going to focus a lot on that one. Because Shakespeare is comparing life to a sea. And that's not a really common comparison. So that's why I like that one a lot. I might also look at that line in Undiscovered Country. And if you look back at the text, it seems like we're talking about death and what's after death. And instead of talking about heaven or hell, which would have been really common in Shakespeare's time to have a religious way of thinking about it, it's referred to as an undiscovered country. And I find that really interesting. So I find it interesting that it's a new location. So now I'm just going to pay attention to certain words. And one thing that I've done to kind of scaffold this is for your choices, pick out some words that you might focus on. What I've found is that if you can think of an alternative word, a synonym, and then see what the differences are between them, it really helps you to see what that first word, the original choice, is doing. So it talks about grunting and sweating under a weary life. And kind of that idea that we stay here and grunt. And so an alternative could be groan. So I would start to think about what would be lost. And what strikes me is groan could be kind of a complaint. So I'm thinking of what it's associated with. It could be unintentional, though. But what I'm really noticing is grunt is something that tends to be kind of a limited noise, whereas groaning is kind of longer. And it's something that I associate kind of with physical pain. And maybe you groan if you're hurt, but a grunt, because he's talking about bearing life, the idea of carrying it, grunt sounds like the sound that you would make because something is heavy. And that starts to really give me a sense of what maybe Shakespeare's doing here. It's saying that life is too heavy. So then I'm going to look at the word coward, and an alternative could be wimp. But there's a kind of a clear difference. Or it could even be someone who's just, afraid, being kind of temporarily fearful. So temporarily fearful is maybe someone who wimps out, we say, which means it's not a permanent word for you, but something that you temporarily did. Whereas coward seems like a permanent label. Wimp might be something that I think of as when someone's maybe more of a child, like wimpy, or when someone's kind of smaller and can't necessarily handle it. But coward seems like something you don't grow out of. And it's a really personal insult. I think it's more hurtful than saying wimp. And then I want to choose a third word that I think did a lot here that's interesting. So I might look at, I might go back actually and pick one of the words that I talked about earlier, like whip or shock, because those are interesting. Hold on one second. Or maybe heartache. I think I like heartache. I'm going to go with heartache. So an alternative to heartache could just be sadness. And I think heartache implies more pain with the word ache in it. I think it has the suggestion that it lasts longer. Sadness can be more temporary. If I said depression, that would be a much longer sadness. But heartache is different. Heartache also suggests that you physically kind of feel the pain. So this is what we do to figure out the emotion, is we actually think what would be different if the author used a different word. And that really starts to show us what's going on. And that helps me looking at all of these things together, these violent and overwhelming images, comparing life to a sea. And seas are something that, yes, you could float in, but ultimately can take your life, especially if it's a sea of trouble, something all-encompassing, dangerous, comparing death to a country. On all these words of grunting and coward and heartache, I really start to think that this person is despairing. That would be the tone I would use. And I would use some of those words I just said. I'm going to spare you watching me type this because I don't want this video to be too long, but I would say this is despairing, that the person saying this has really lost all hope. They don't think death will help because they don't know what that will look like. And life isn't that great either. It's full of these whips and scorns. And so I think they're full of despair. I don't think, however, that they are, and this is something we do sometimes to kind of test our hypothesis for tone. We look at an alternative word. I don't think they're resigned, because if this person was resigned, they would have accepted it. And I don't see acceptance here. I see a lot of struggle. I see asking questions. I see being kind of outraged with these exclamation marks. I see a lot of struggle with all the questions they're asking. So I don't think resigned works well, because I don't think they've accepted it. So I'll skip you writing that all out. And then I want to kind of put it all together. And I will type this out for you and share it with you, but I don't want to watch you actually have to suffer through my typing and watching this. So here's what I would say to put it all together. The context, I know, is Hamlet considering suicide. So he wishes he could end his life, but realizes that he's afraid of what might come in the afterlife. So in the speech, he's noticing that he's stuck. He communicates this with figurative language, so I'm bringing in that evidence, calling his life a sea of troubles. This line suggests that Hamlet's troubles are not just difficult, they are deep, dangerous, and engulfing like a sea. At the same time, he calls the afterlife an undiscovered country, as though it is a place that is wild and uncivilized. Because neither place is a safe choice, Hamlet says people continue to, quote, grunt and bear the suffering in their lives, as though that suffering isn't just emotional, but physically tiring and painful as well. He calls himself a, quote, coward, rather than someone who is simply fearful or a wimp, because coward is a strong word that is personal, and it's an insult rather than simply an expression of a temporary state of mind. Ultimately, the tone of this passage is despairing. It's supported by Hamlet's strong use of negative words to describe his life and his situation, such as, quote, weary life, quote, heartache, and, quote, whips and scorns of time. So that's what I'm going to ask you to do. So I'm going to share with you this model and the other two passages that you can choose from, along with the PowerPoint and the word bank. If you have any questions, let me know.